Okay, operating on 4 hours of sleep as a new dad, but he's ready. And thank God your PhD's done, is Dr. Zachary Jerome from Mcity. He's here to talk a little bit about using connected vehicle data for something really new and interesting, automatically retiming traffic signals. Zachary, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Greg. Unfortunately, it was more than 4 last night. But thank you all. As Greg mentioned, I'm Zachary. I'm a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at UMTRI and Mcity. I work also in Dr. Liu's Mobility Transformation Lab, which is his research lab at UMTRI. And so to give a little bit of where's my, the clicker. Thank you. To give a little bit of motivation behind this research, this is actually, I pulled this image from Google Street View. This is a traffic signalized intersection I travel on my way to work every morning, and just so happens that if you go on Street View, you can actually capture this image where there's a red light here, but there's no vehicles moving through the intersection. So this is very frustrating for, I think, many people, common experience here. And so there's actually a study done by NREX a few years ago that found that individual drivers spend around 18 seconds idling at each intersection they encounter on their commutes or daily travel. And what might be interesting about that is that's not necessarily super, if you think on an individual level, that obviously is annoying. But once we scale that up to the more than 300,000 intersections in the United States, the problem quickly becomes, much bigger in terms of, a follow-up study by the National Operations Center of Excellence found that drivers experience roughly $22.9 billion in congestion costs just at signalized intersections alone. And then also that previous study I mentioned before by NREX found that just a 1 second reduction in delay at every intersection would save around 1.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent annually. And if you're like me, you have no idea what that means conceptually. I typed that into ChatGPT and found that was roughly 3/4 of Ann Arbor's total annual emissions. So just give you a scale of just being able to shave 1 second off at each intersections would go a long way in terms of the scalability of the problem. And so I think another thing that makes this particularly frustrating for drivers or road users in general is that there seems to be an obvious solution, is that this would, just turn the light green and that would solve the problem that I just mentioned on the previous slide. And actually, traffic signal retiming is one of the most cost-effective ways to alleviate congestion. When I say traffic signal retiming, what I mean is just adjusting the right-of-way allocation in response to changing traffic patterns. And the reason it's so cost-effective is because it requires no changes to the physical infrastructure. Usually it's just a coding change in the controller at the intersection. We're not, adding another lane or adding a new traffic light or anything like that in terms of infrastructure. So it's very cost-effective. However, the reason I highlighted in the previous slide, the reason that we're not seeing such a dynamic response to the traffic patterns right now is the signal retiming is only usually conducted on a 3 to 5 year fixed rotation. And it's difficult / expensive to monitor the entire traffic network. So most intersections, we just had a great presentation before me that, have all this equipment that's monitoring our intersections, but most intersections in the US do not have any sort of monitoring capabilities. And if you imagine, I mentioned before, there's 300,000 plus intersections, very cost prohibitive right now to put detection at all 300,000 intersections. And so what most intersections operate on is they operate on what's called a fixed timing plan, meaning that we just set the parameters ahead of time and the controller at the intersection just sort of cycles through that plan throughout the day. And so because of that, whenever a traffic agency goes and retimes their signal network, they usually select those intersections on a pre-fixed cycle. So sort of like if you operate 100 intersections, maybe you do 20 each year. And so every 5 years, you're sort of cycling through all your intersections. And the reason that you can only do 20 is because you have to normally go out and do some sort of temporary collection. There's the data collection to get the volumes is very time consuming, and then you have to input that in the model and so on and so forth. And so what I like to liken this is it's sort of like if we were to perform surgery without really knowing what the symptoms of the diagnostics are, because we're selecting what intersections we want to optimize before we even know what's happening at those intersections. And so really the opportunity that we've identified is if we look at this, it's many different names. I use probe data in the title, but you also think of telematics data. Basically, data that we're collecting from connected vehicles, we believe has the potential to bring very dynamic and responsive signal control solutions. And this video that I'm showing here is just an example of one data set that we work with, where you can sort of see even though it's a small percentage of vehicles, you see roughly maybe 7% of the vehicles in the traffic network right now. But even just from this view, you can sort of kind of get a picture of what's happening in the traffic network, where vehicles are experiencing delay, where maybe they're experiencing particularly delay at intersections. And so this data, why it's so powerful, is it's providing 24/7 24/7 data on almost every signalized intersection through cloud and cellular communications. It's becoming increasingly available through existing services, roadside assistance, ride hailing, and navigation. And then, like I mentioned before, even though you just have limited observations, you're still given pretty good insight into the overall traffic performance. So, why does this present an opportunity for scalable automatic signal optimization? Well, the ability to collect the probe data provides previously unavailable signal optimization opportunities. I mentioned before, we don't have very good monitoring at all the intersections. Well, now we're collecting information through cellular communications online. And so this presents an opportunity to automatically generate new timing plans, where we can then advance those fixed time signals I mentioned before. So maybe from what's now a static system that's only updated every 3 to 5 years, now we could do it more dynamically or more iteratively. Maybe we reduce that timeline to once a year or once a quarter or so on and so forth. And so, and the other advantage to this is we can be a little bit less reliant on the infrastructure-based sensors, which are a little bit cost prohibitive for most agencies at a large scale. And so the advantages to this is, maybe you've seen a figure similar to this before, but if this figure is just showing, as changing traffic patterns occur, we see more and more congestion energy consumption. And so if you wait 3 to 5 years to retime your signalized intersections, you have this huge lost opportunity, where if we had faster iterations, we could sort of recover a little bit of that lost opportunity that's presented with a 3 to 5 year time frame. However, there are very few systems that can execute a complete signal optimization procedure just using probe data right now. And so that's where our research came in. And I mentioned before, I was only observing the data set we've used only roughly around 7% of vehicles. But even with that 7%, there are some pretty cool advantages that I want to highlight. The first is what we call the temporal spatial information. So in terms of time and space, if we know where the vehicle is, it gives us insight into the other situations that are occurring at that intersection. So this figure I showed before, if we have an observed stop vehicle, we can sort of infer the number of vehicles that are stopped ahead of that vehicle. So in this case, just based off of the stop position, we know that there are probably roughly 3 vehicles stopped ahead of that. The other thing that is super valuable from this data is things like performance information. So we can get things like wait time, the number of times a vehicle stopped at the intersection. What's particularly powerful is if you have ever arrived at an intersection, you stop, the light turns green, some vehicles go through, and then the light turns red again before you can go through. You've effectively stopped twice before you clear the intersection. This probe vehicle data is very good at reading that. And so those are some cool performance values that we can get from the trajectory data. So once we can aggregate enough of this information, both the temporal spatial information and the performance data I mentioned before, this can provide us a pretty accurate view of the conditions of each intersection. And so the main obstacle, though, this is just telling us what's happening at the intersection. The main obstacle further is the prediction, or the ability to know what will happen if we change the signal timing plan, or what is the specific signal timing need at this intersection that would alleviate the problems that we're observing. And so that's where our research comes in. So what I show here is on the left side, this is sort of the current practice. I've alluded to this a little bit so far, but if we start with real world traffic networks on the far left, I'm sorry, I keep pointing down here like you guys know what I'm pointing at. I'll try to stop doing that. But on the left, you see real world traffic networks. And then if we have data collection in terms of vehicle counts from detectors, or you might have a manual count. But usually what you're doing in the current practice is you're getting volumes. And once you get those volumes, you can input that into some sort of existing model for prediction that allows you to optimize the signal timing plan in response to those volumes. What we're proposing is a pro-based measure where now we're getting 24/7 trajectory observations, and we have a low penetration rate, so we're only observing roughly 5-10% of vehicles, but we have the temporal spatial information and the performance measures I mentioned before. And so we have our Nature Communications paper that was published 2 years ago now at this point, and what that was able to do is generate a model that was able to predict what would happen if we change signal timing plans just by using that low penetration rate observations. And so that led to some other work. We've been working with the Road Commission for Oakland County on this since about 2021 now at this point, so 5 years. And that led to a real world trial implementation in Birmingham, where we were, like I said before, we're observing roughly 7% of all vehicles. This is the paper I mentioned before. It was a remote optimization, so we executed it in roughly 1 to 2 weeks just for a first trial run. The delay in number of stops dropped by up to 20% and 40%. So this figure right here, sorry, I don't have a laser pointer. I can't really show you what I can't point specifically to different areas, but you'll see on the left side before, as a vehicle travels through that corridor, it's having to stop multiple times. And then after our retiming, we were able to reduce the number of stops, and so delay and stops reduced along that corridor. Another project with MDOT demonstrated that we were able to, our system had a comparable performance to that of a traditional optimization. So we were, in that particular project, we were able to compare directly to a previous sort of traditional retiming. And what was neat about that is, especially since it's comparable, that the actual performance of the optimization was comparable. But with that, we can now leverage the advantages of the trajectory data, where we're able to do this more iteratively and more responsively compared to the traditional retiming. And so that led to the USD SMART program. I'm going to skip through a couple of top parts, but the main point I wanted to mention was that Oakland County won a stage 1 planning and prototyping grant for this vehicle trajectory-based signal optimization system, where they wanted to generate the signal performance and diagnostics for the entire county. And then we also were going to provide the signal optimization services to 30 to 40 intersections. So the diagnostics. We started with Oakland County. They have close to or more than 1,400 signalized intersections in the county. And so how to select the 30 to 40 intersections that we wanted to optimize was a particular challenge when we started this project. And so this figure on the right just kind of shows the distribution of all the intersections in the county. And what we realized was that sometimes performance evaluations that I mentioned before, sometimes those are not necessarily enough to be able to tell you where the most opportunity is for retiming. And what do I mean by that? I mean, sometimes maybe there's a lot of delay at an intersection, but there's not really anything you can do about it just because there's just a lot of traffic at that intersection. On the flip side, there might be intersections that have relatively low delay, but there's actually large opportunities for retiming just based off of the way that the geometry is or the current signal timing is. So we developed a set of tools to evaluate opportunities for signal retiming improvements, things like green time imbalances. We also evaluated coordination issues between intersections. So basically trying to identify how well the intersections are performing together. And so there we were able to identify 40 intersections that we then were going to iteratively monitor throughout the project. So we started this cycle of monitoring, optimization, implementation, and we cycle through this pattern repeatedly throughout the project. So roughly every quarter, we're able to retime the signal timing plans at those intersections. And so this is just one example of how the diagnostic works. So what I'm showing here is some observed trajectories through time and space. So if you start at the top, that's where the vehicles are entering the corridor. They travel along the distance of roughly 2,000 meters, and the x-axis is time. So what we do is we plot these intersections, and you can kind of see we're able to align these intersections roughly according to the current signal timing plan based off of when they depart. So we can sort of align all the observations based off of when they depart. You can see that they're all kind of grouped together by their departure time there. And so roughly as they travel along the first two intersections, there's some pretty uniform behavior. But when we get to the third intersection, you can see that the trajectory traveling through the intersection is kind of variable. There's kind of a lot of different things happening there. And so this is what we would call a cycle length, or basically the intersections were not performing together very well. They're not coordinated, as I mentioned before. And so we observe this, and after the retiming that we performed, once we identified this, you can see now that these trajectories move in a much more, platoons, if you will, throughout the corridor. And this resulted in a travel time difference along the corridor of an average of almost a half a minute per trajectory, or per observation. So this is just one example of using this trajectory data to first observe or diagnose the signal timing issue, and then perform the optimization to fix that signal timing issue. So the results of our overall project, I mentioned we identified 40 intersections. I want to circle back to the very beginning of the presentation when I mentioned that drivers spend around 18 seconds idling at each intersection. We scale that to 300,000 intersections. I mentioned that's roughly if we took 1 second reduction at each intersection, that's roughly 3/4 of Ann Arbor's total emissions. So what was the results of the 40 intersections so far after just a couple, one, in some cases, 2 iterations so far at those intersections? Well, the average delay per intersection reduced from around 17.8 seconds, so that's roughly around the average from before. We dropped it down to 15 seconds. So that's almost 2.8 seconds per observation, per movement at each intersection. So that's a 20% reduction in delay. And then the average number of stops per intersection reduced from 0.39 to 0.32. And so, I highlight this to show, 3 seconds per driver, maybe not super noticeable to the common driver on the road, but when we aggregate this, that's where we see the huge advantages. Think about the thousands of vehicles that are traveling through each through each intersection. So the yearly savings across those 40 intersections, just from a rough estimation, that's 200,000 hours of travel time and 660 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And I know I'm out of time, but just to summarize, I have two last slides here. Summarize, we're building an integrated traffic signal timing optimization system where we want to do the performance measures, the diagnostics, and also perform the traffic signal optimization. We want to be able to move We want to be able to move the practice from a 3 to 5 year fixed schedule to a more proactive signal timing regimen. And we believe this is offering a feasible and economical solution that could be applied to every traffic signal in the world. I also mentioned before that we're utilizing trajectory data from approximately 7% of vehicles, but with increases in automation and connectivity, we are going to see those penetration rates increase, and we see more and more opportunities for trajectory-based traffic signal control. The last slide I want to mention is just some of the next steps to tech transfer. Dr. Liu mentioned in his earlier talk about the commercialization and research moving towards together, and so we've been able to sort of take some initial steps in that concept with this particular technology, because we're now moving from more research-based projects. We want to move to more sustainable deployments. And to facilitate that, we've launched a startup company, Connected Traffic Intelligence, and we are actively pursuing commercial deployments with agencies and consultants. So with that, I am out of time and happy to answer questions now or in the break that is following.
How much can you reduce the man hours required to optimize an intersection using this method?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have the exact number for you on that, but I can give you some insights into this. Basically, it takes us about, I mentioned 1 to 2 weeks in the initial time. It now takes us probably around 2 or 3 days to do the optimization, just me and my lab mate. Whereas probably a timing optimization project the traditional way would probably take more around 2 or 3 weeks, something like that. But what's the other advantage to this as well that I want to highlight is a lot of it is the monitoring capabilities that's reduced. I mentioned before they had to go out and collect signal timing, volumes at the intersection. Now we're able to do this automatically. So the performance measures I showed you, that's all collected pretty much in seconds. So that's the true advantage to it right now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Zachary. All right, let's take a break. You can hit up Zachary and ask him about fatherhood or ask him about connected intersections, whatever you like. Let's come back at 11:05. Can we do a 6-minute break? I know that's a little ambitious. Let's do it. All right, thanks a lot.